What's up, legends? Welcome back to my Unmatched Strategy Guide series. Today we are taking a look at Bigfoot, the mythical beast credited by Wikipedia for starting the furry movement. Now, fun little trivia tidbit about this hero's design. Restoration Games actually modeled Bigfoot's deck to replicate a vacuum, and this is perfectly implemented in the way that all hope is sucked out of your opponent's very soul as soon as the match starts. Statistically, Bigfoot is a melee fighter with 16 health. His sidekick, the Jack-O-Lantern, is also a melee fighter with 6 health, and they have a movement value of 3. The relatively high move value complements Bigfoot's ability, as his ability is a lot better because he is a move 3 hero. It would be a lot worse on a move 2 hero, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Bigfoot also has a ton of move effects in his deck, so you are quite a quick, thick boyo. 16 hit points is 1 point above the average for a single hero health total, but single health points can sometimes decide the fate of the galaxy, or maybe just this one game, so this is a decent total overall. The Jackalope only has 6 measly health points, the current minimum for sidekicks, and joins Tara the Porter and Xander/Giles as members of the Won't See Turn 4 club, as 6 health is really easy for your opponent to slice through. However, the Jackalope can block with literally all of the cards that Bigfoot can block with, so you have access to lots of cards to block with, but also good cards to block with. Together, they have a health pool of 22, which is 2 points above average, and surprisingly high actually, as Bigfoot is tied with Spike for the 6th highest health pool in the game. So even though this health total doesn't look like a lot, it's actually quite up there. In terms of deck composition, Biggie has 11 unique cards, which is very good. This means your draws will be more consistent from game to game than a hero with like 15 or 16 unique cards. And in addition to this, all but 3 of your different cards have 3 copies each. This is good because cards that only have 1 or 2 copies, you're less likely to see every game, and therefore if your deck relies on them because of how powerful they are and you don't see them, that hurts you a lot more than if you have 3 copies of a good card, which is the problem that King Arthur has with Excalibur, but that is something we will also talk about later. As for Bigfoot's ability, it says at the end of your turn, if there are no opposing fighters in Bigfoot's zone, you may draw 1 card. Cards are a very important resource in this game. They're how you actually attack your opponent, and health, cards, and actions, I think, are the 3 most important resources in the game in that order. Having more cards than your opponent, otherwise known as card advantage, is a very important concept in any card game, but particularly in Unmatched. In Unmatched, you attack and defend with cards, so having more cards gives you more flexibility in what options you have when you're choosing what to attack with and to block with. And there are a ton of other benefits to having a large hand size, particularly protecting individual cards against random discard effects, for example. So Bigfoot joins Angel, Dracula, and Muldoon as the current heroes with card drawing abilities. And no surprise, Bigfoot's ability is the best. This is because of the consistency of each ability. Angel draws cards when he loses attack combats, which in order to actually win the game, you don't want to do that often. You also, in very few scenarios, will actually know if you're going to lose an attack unless you're playing an attack with a very low value. Dracula and Muldoon both draw cards based on their opponent's positioning, so in certain scenarios, your opponent can just deny you of card draw. So Bigfoot, his ability says end of turn. This is good because that means he can choose to use the ability on his own terms. Dracula's ability says start of turn, which means your opponent has their turn to mess with you and deny you of using your ability. Bigfoot can do it whenever he wants. This leads Bigfoot to having a lot of control over his hand size, and you'll never really run out of steam card-wise, and you can really punish your opponent for not being able to match your draw ability. His ability says if there are no opposing fighters in Bigfoot's zone, which means at the end of your turn, you have to be by yourself in what I'm going to call an empty zone. However, the Jackalope, your sidekick, can also be in the same zone as you, and your ability will work just fine. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to zones that Bigfoot can proc his ability in as empty zones. So there are currently 4 heroes with multiple sidekicks in the game. So something that these heroes can do is they can try to limit the amount of empty zones you can use by spreading out all their fighters across the map to limit the amount of zones you can flee to. However, this isn't the best strategy in my opinion because they can't cover the whole map. Most maps have 6 to 8 zones and the largest team is currently 5 fighters. And this also makes their fighters really easy to kill as they only have 1 health, so they're all not really much of a threat individually. And you could also just go after their unprotected hero, as most multi-sidekick heroes don't really have a lot of health. So both their hero and sidekick will be easy to kill if they do this. So I think you can just counter them, countering your ability by just trying to kill them. And for all your other matchups, there are 11 fighters with 1 sidekick and 4 solo heroes, and I don't think either of these team compositions can put up much resistance against your ability because they will most of the time only be able to cover 1 or 2 zones, maybe 3 or 4 if they are on multi-zone spaces, but I think you will not really run into trouble against teams like this. And of course, I'm talking about this from a one-on-one perspective, as in a 2v2 matchup, there will be a lot more enemy fighters on the board, but that is a whole different can of worms. This ability also encourages kiting with advantage, which is a lot better than kiting with disadvantage, which means your turn action pattern will be attack then maneuver, and I'm assuming you will maneuver to an empty zone where you can draw a card. So that's just a really powerful pattern that if your opponent can't mess up somehow, you'll be in a very good spot for most of the game. I mentioned this before, but your deck is set up to help you move around the board. You have a ton of movement effects on your cards, which only increases your potential to utilize this ability. And another good thing about this ability is that the wording says may, so you never have to draw a card if you don't want to, particularly when your hand is full. A lot of decks struggle because they can't maintain card advantage, which hurts them in one way or another. King Arthur, for example, could endlessly boost attacks if he could only draw more. And so far, of all the heroes I've gone over, Sinbad and Medusa are great examples of heroes with card advantage consistency, as Sinbad has a ton of card draw, while Medusa herself doesn't draw cards. She just makes you discard yours. So while it might be coincidental that those two are pretty dominant heroes, I'd like to think that their dominance is connected to their consistent card advantage. So Bigfoot's ability is very easy to frequently use, as it's hard for your opponent to counter. It works on any map, and it synergizes with the numerous movement effects in your deck, and it helps you draw cards, which are very important. In my opinion, Bigfoot's ability is the best ability in the game. I just think what it does and how it works with his deck is more powerful than any other hero's ability. While it might not be as flashy, drawing a card is probably a very underrated effect. And if you disagree with me, I would love to hear a well thought out counter argument in the comments. Now, we all know Bigfoot is famous for hiding, but he cannot hide his cards from me. The first one is Larger Than Life. Now, if you've played around with the Battle of Legends Volume 1 set, this card might look very familiar. It's a hero-only 6 value attack with a boost value of 3. This hasn't been done before, has it? Has it? Wait a minute, this card is nothing like Excalibur. Look, there's 3 copies of it. Memes aside, this is the card that makes Bigfoot Bigfoot. A 6 value attack is basically a guaranteed 2 to 3 damage, if not more. And your opponent is in big trouble if they block this with a feint, a regroup, or nothing at all. Now, I can't even imagine blocking with a regroup or nothing against Bigfoot, but if your opponent is unlucky enough to have to do that against you, you're in a really good place. This card obviously has no effect, and that's fine because of the high value of the card. And as further evidence of how crazy this card is, other decks have attacks that have no text on them, and they are value 5s. I know I keep bringing up this hero, but I just have to. The whole gimmick of King Arthur's deck is the mighty Excalibur. He has a single copy of that, and then he has a scheme to either find it in his deck or fish it out of his discard pile to maybe play twice. And Bigfoot has 3 copies of Excalibur. I know some of you might be tired of hearing this, but it's not an Unmatched Strategy guide unless I bash King Arthur. And in this case, it's necessary. A 6 value attack is absolutely insane. It's a very powerful single card, but Bigfoot has 3 copies of it. In terms of actual strategy with this card, you draw the card, you play the card, and then you watch your opponent lower their health dial. A simple 3-step system. I prefer to use this on heroes instead of sidekicks because of the potential damage you can do. But if they have an important sidekick, this is a good tool to try to take them out while using the least amount of cards. You cannot have too much arrogance, however, against the Invisible Man, Little Red, and Beowulf, as they either have cards that will punish you for playing high value attacks or nullify the value of your card. Little Red has both of these. So in every other matchup, you can very happily play this card without a second thought, but in those 3, you might want to consider what cards they've already played before this. Larger Than Life is probably the biggest no-brainer in all of Unmatched. The next card is Savagery, a Bigfoot-only 4 value attack with a boost value of 3 and 3 copies. It says, after combat, if you won the combat, deal 1 damage to each fighter adjacent to Bigfoot. The after combat ability will really punish opponents who clump all their fighters around Bigfoot. And if they have multiple sidekicks and they do this, you can use Savagery to essentially just kill all of their sidekicks in 1 attack. Robin Hood, Dracula, Muldoon, and Medusa are currently the 4 multi-sidekick heroes, and you will win this attack against Robin Hood every single time, which also helps because he's your set counterpart. So Robin Hood versus Bigfoot is a matchup that I think is quite common. While the other 3 heroes only have like 2 or 3 non-feint cards to potentially block this with so that you won't win the combat. So this is an excellent card in the matchups where you really want the area of effect or AoE damage. You also have 3 copies of this, so it will hopefully be readily available and you can just stomp out those annoying 1 health pests. In matchups where you don't need the AoE for multiple sidekicks, which is all the other matchups in the game, you can use this to maybe hit both of their fighters if they have a single sidekick, although they might not position their fighters like that if they know you have this card. But if you can hit both of them, it would be great. If you can't, it's still a fine card because if you win the combat, you're doing at least 2 damage, maybe even 3. And if they block it, they've used a high value block card that they could have otherwise used on Larger Than Life, or they played a feint. If this gets feinted, it feels kind of bad for you, but you're still doing 2 damage to them, so you can live with that. This card does have some drawbacks, however. It is strictly an attack, which means it can only be played on your turn and will therefore be slightly telegraphed. And the enemy has to leave themselves in a position to get hit by this in terms of AoE. So more experienced players will probably not clump up all their sidekicks around you if they know this card exists. So most of the time, you might only be able to hit 1 or 2 things with this, but like I said before, that's probably fine. The other downside is that this is an after combat effect that requires adjacency, which means if your enemy played a block card with a movement effect on it and moves away from you, you won't trigger the ability unless they had a different fighter adjacent to you at the start of combat. Also, the text says each fighter, which includes the Jackalope, so obviously try not to hurt your own sidekick with this. Overall, this is a very solid card. It takes a nice second place to Larger Than Life, but it's still a very powerful attack. The next card is Crash Through the Trees, a Bigfoot-only scheme with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says, move Bigfoot up to 5 spaces. You may move Bigfoot through spaces containing opposing fighters. The 2 key words there are Bigfoot and Bigfoot, as this is a move card that will only move Bigfoot. The Jackalope will get one of his own, but we'll see that in a little bit. This is one of the best mobility cards in the game. 5 spaces is a lot for a single move effect, and it's only really bested in my book by Mistform and similar teleportation effects. A move 2 character would have to boost their movement just to reach you in 1 turn, or use a similar scheme. And this amount will essentially guarantee you the use of your ability if you use it to get to an empty zone. as without looking at any maps, I'm like 99% sure you can get to a different zone in 5 spaces or less on every single map. Also, the effect on a scheme is a lot better than this effect on an attack or black card, as you can use this on demand as an action on your turn, which gives you a lot of flexibility in timing the use of this card. You can either use it defensively to get the heck out of dodge, which the effect of moving through opposing fighters is very useful for, and you can also use this offensively to surprise attack your opponent, as they probably won't expect you to be able to move 5 spaces through sidekick meat shields, pop up behind their hero, and then slam something like a momentous shift down on them, which has great synergy with this card. You could also use this to set up Savagery, which might require some positioning finesse in order to hit multiple targets. You do only have 2 copies of this, so use it kind of sparingly, but other than that, this is the ultimate movement card for an already super mobile character, and this has a lot of synergy with your ability and cards in your deck. Surprisingly, there are only 3 Bigfoot only cards, so it's time for the sidekick segment. Enter the Cantaloupe. It only has 1 unique card, and it's a scheme. So the Jackalope acts as an extension of Bigfoot, as it can use all the attacks except for Savagery and Larger Than Life, and all the block cards that Bigfoot can use. So the shared card pool between these 2 fighters is very large. This flexibility is nice because it means the Jackalope can slap your opponent pretty hard. It also makes him a lot more it makes it a lot more durable, as it can block with all the same cards that Bigfoot can use. So even though it has 6 health, which isn't a lot, it's probably still more durable than the other members of the there's a 4th turn club, although I'm not properly accounting for Terra being able to come back from the dead. The singular special sidekick card is Jackalope Horns, a scheme with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. It says, move the Jackalope up to 5 spaces. You may move the Jackalope through spaces containing opposing fighters. Then deal 2 damage to any 1 fighter adjacent to the Jackalope. An obvious theme that's becoming more and more apparent for this deck is being super mobile, and this is another very good card for that. 5 spaces is again a lot for a single movement effect, and of course being able to move through opponents will be very useful when they try to throw meat shields in front of your real prize. The damage effect attached to this, which makes it different than Crash Through the Trees, makes this an offensively oriented card, and I recommend using this as the first action on your turn to approach your opponent, stab them with your horns, and then usually follow up with an attack. Momentous Shift is a great candidate here, but alternatively, you can just maneuver away, content with the 2 unblockable damage you just dealt. Keeping the Jackalope alive long enough to be able to use all 3 copies of this card is advised, as 6 free damage is nothing to scoff at. I say free because it's direct scheme damage, which means your opponent can't do anything to cancel it or block it. This can be used to reduce the enemy hero's health, as 6 damage is like 40% of the average hero health total, and that's super annoying. But if they have a single sidekick, I would use this to quickly whittle them down for the same reason that I would use Larger Than Life on a sidekick, because it's just a very efficient, fast way to kill them. Direct damage is very good against fighters with 7 health on average, which is why I will typically save scheme damage for sidekicks if it's early in the game. But if they have multiple sidekicks, sure, you can use this card to just murk one of them straight up, but I would rather use Savagery as previously described if possible. The guaranteed damage attached to a movement effect is a great tool to get your sidekick involved in the fray, and can greatly annoy and even surprise your opponent. Just like Crash Through the Trees, this is another shoelace in your sneakers of speed, or something like that. Hopefully that made sense. And that's it for the Jackalope. We will now dive into the any cards, which there are quite a few of in this deck. The first of which is Disengage, a 4-value any attack with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, choose an empty space in this fighter's zone. Place this fighter in that space. This card is also found within Angel and the Raptors decks, which sounds like a great band name now that I say that out loud. And this is a good card, very similar to Skirmish, that enables kiting with advantage. You can also reset it if you use this as the second action on your turn. It allows you to maneuver, attack, and then not leave yourself in a vulnerable position for your opponent's turn. However, Usually, due to positioning, your fighter will still be in the same zone as the opposing fighter if you were in the same zone for the attack, which means if you use this card as Bigfoot and it's the second action on your turn, you won't be able to proc your ability. This can be nullified by either attacking your opponent from a different zone, so you're still adjacent but you're in two different zones, or attacking from a multi-zone space and just moving into a zone that your opposing fighter was not in. However, you won't often in a match, I'd say, get this perfect positioning I just described. So I think this card is more useful to use as the Jackalope than as Bigfoot. You can also just use this as the first action on your turn as Bigfoot, and then if you're still in the same zone, just maneuver to a different one. But I think this is better on the Jackalope because you can use something like Jackalope Horns, then attack with this and move the Jackalope back away from your opponent, and the Jackalope is in a less compromised position for the start of your opponent's turn. This card is very similar to Skirmish, and that's a pretty decent card. So this is just another solid attack, but the effect is also guaranteed, but it's not versatile. So it's similar to Skirmish, probably a little bit better in this deck because you also have Skirmish. So I'd say, yeah, this card is better than Skirmish, and it doesn't leave you vulnerable. So it's a very good defensively oriented offense card. The next card does not physically exist, as it's just your imagination. However, if this card did exist, it would be a 3-value any block card with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. If this card did exist, it would say immediately cancel all effects on your opponent's card, but that's of course ridiculous because this card doesn't exist. The first glaring observation to make about this card is that it has the same text as Feint, but some other parts of this card are a little bit different. For example, the value is 3 instead of 2, and the color is blue instead of purple. Feint is one of the best block cards in the game. It can completely shut down your opponent's powerful effects, but it doesn't block much in the name of value. So if Feint was a value 3 card, it would be a lot better because then it would block more value but still shut down the same amount of effect. This card is a 3-value Feint, which is, again, very obvious to see. Wow, great analysis, Baked. Yeah, I know. But you can play Feint on offense. You can't play this card on offense. And that's something I've talked about a little bit in my Feint video. But very rarely in a game do you actually ever play Feint on offense. And only in select matchups would I even recommend considering entertaining that thought. So the fact that you can only play It's Just Your Imagination on defense is not actually a downside at all. So this card is just nuts. It's better than a Feint, and it expands your total cancellation potential from 3 cards to 5 cards, which is a really big jump. Of the 11 ideal cards to block with in this deck, 5 is almost half of that number. This takes pressure off of trying to find and draw feints from your deck, as well as manage your hand and maybe save them or play them now. You don't have that problem at all because now 16% of your deck is a Feint-like card, and you will be able to heavily slow down your opponent with all your cancellation, especially if they have a plethora of effect-based attacks like Sinbad or Little Red. As Little Red reaches into her basket, Bigfoot reaches into his own basket and pulls out a singular post-it note that says no on it in capital letters. People say Bigfoot is one of the most powerful fighters in the game, and they look at larger than life as an example of why he's so powerful. I think this card is equally as powerful because it makes him a defensive juggernaut in addition to being offensively very gifted. Just like how that last card wasn't real, this card is a hoax. A 4-value versatile any with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. It says, after combat, move your fighter up to 5 spaces. You may move that fighter through spaces containing opposing fighters. And I thought Leap Away was a super skirmish. This has the Bigfoot typical move 5 spaces through opposing fighters effect, which I will repeat, is very good. Offensively, this lets you bash your opponent and then get the heck out of dodge, which will almost always let you use your ability as Bigfoot. However, for this deck, and especially when attacking as Bigfoot, You have a lot of designated attacks you would rather play, which makes me prefer to use this card on defense as a strong value block card, which lets you move on your opponent's turn, which, as I've stressed in my previous strategy guides, is an effect that I tend to highly value, as then you don't have to spend an action on your turn maneuvering, so you can block with this card to potentially set up a double attack combo on your turn, or just move somewhere more advantageous for you in whatever situation you're in. This is a very flexible card with a good value and a very powerful effect. Lastly, I will briefly gloss over the basic cards in this deck. We have the standard 12-card vanilla package, including 3 feints, which, as I mentioned before, you have a lot less pressure to find and save because you don't know jack. It's just your imagination exists. So you can be a lot less hesitant when determining whether or not you want to play a feint this turn or not. You have 3 skirmishes, which are useful as a high-value block card, while also being useful to activate your ability after an attack. But I think you have better cards to do that with, and I would relegate at least 2 copies of skirmish, if not all 3, for defense only. You have feints, and it's just your imagination for cancel blocking, and you have skirmishes and hoaxes for value blocking. And I think having those 2 options, basically almost always available in your hand, is great, depending on what matchup you're in. You have 3 momentous shifts, which have great synergy with all the movement effects in your deck. But if you don't draw well, you might have to use this as a block card, as just a 3-value block card with no text if your hand is too attack heavy, or you just don't draw your other block cards. And lastly, you have 3 regroups, which are very easy to bait as Bigfoot, as usually every other attack coming from the hero will be at least value 4, if not higher. And you can make your opponent waste really good block cards much more easily than any other hero, because the immense threat level of your other cards makes this a lot less awful. Do not use this as a block card, especially with the Jackalope. Only use this as an attack and watch your opponents suffer with agony when they waste their best block card blocking a regroup when they thought they would be blocking a larger than life. I think it's finally final thoughts time. I'm sorry. This should come as no surprise to anyone with knowledge of the Unmatched meta, but Bigfoot is considered one of the best heroes in the game, if not the best. I would consider him the Tim Duncan of Unmatched, and I'll explain what that means. Sorry for the reference to American basketball. I think Bigfoot is so dominant because he has amazing fundamentals. Card draw, mobility, card values, deck consistency, and defensive capabilities are all things that every fighter really wants, but Bigfoot excels in every single one of those categories. He doesn't have super flashy effects like action chaining, healing, discard effects, or any sort of combo capability, but he's a jack of all trades type character. And while this might make him a bit boring thematically, you cannot deny that his consistency gives him immense power. His deck is fairly easy to pilot, requiring much less strenuous decision making than other heroes. I'm not saying he doesn't have any skill required. I'm just saying that his deck gives you the chance to make big plays with little risk and gives you a lot of extra room to literally wiggle out of mistakes. Larger Than Life is a great attack that can do a lot of damage, and you have 3 copies of it. You have 8 cards that let you move your fighter 5 spaces through opponents, and you have 13 cards that can let you move after combat. You will always be able to have more cards in your hand than your opponent thanks to your ability, and of course, you have 5 feints. Personally, I think Bigfoot is slightly uninteresting to play, but that's just my preference. The general strategy seems to be the famous Teddy Roosevelt policy of go fast and use big numbers, whereas I like characters like Bruce Lee, the Raptors, and Little Red that require a little bit of planning and some sort of setup in order to execute action chains or combos. And for me, Bigfoot is just a little too simple. But I still believe Bigfoot to be the best unmatched hero on paper. But I'm going to talk more about his place in the overall meta in the set summary for Robin Hood versus Bigfoot. And I'd love to have a viewer-driven discussion segment in that video about how good Bigfoot is. So please let me know what ranking you'd give Bigfoot compared to some of the other unmatched fighters. Medusa. Sherlock Holmes. So thank you so much for watching. Robin Hood's video will be out sometime in the next week, so look forward to that. And as always, like, subscribe, and yeet!